CBSE Board, Class 9, History, Chapter 1, Part 10, audio by Rini Matthew. We saw that there were some changes made in the case of women. Earlier, the revolutionary government did not grant so many rights to the women. So because of that, they really fought against it. There were 2-3 clubs which were formed, and that came to the prominent position of the society. What were the names of those clubs? The Society of Revolutionary and Republican Women. Almost 60 clubs formed by the women were so famous. And we can see that some changes were brought about, especially in the case of marriage, where it was decided to be a contract entered freely and registered at will. It came under the detection of law. And of course, divorce was also made legal. So all these were some of the changes. But apart from that, women could now train for jobs. They used to work as servants. They used to do all these household simple jobs in and around the places, in and around the houses. But apart from that, they could now give training for jobs. They could become artists or run small businesses. All these things were denied of women earlier. That is what you have to remember. They just could serve. They couldn't train anybody. Now they could possess professional grip of the business. They could have a grip on artistry and all that. Women's struggle for equal political rights, however, continued. So the struggle kept on. It was like they kept at the struggle. Now during the Reign of Terror, so Reign of Terror was by the great leader called Robespierre. So during this particular reign, the new government issued laws ordering closure of women's clubs. So that is why there was a lot of agitation among the women, because a lot of clubs were closed, especially the ones run by the women. And many of the political activities by women were banned. That also led to a great agitation. Many prominent women were arrested and a number of them executed. So more of terror. Already there were a lot of agitation and disturbance in the nation, where many people were arrested and people were going in for revolts and rivalry. But apart from that, women had to face a lot of struggle. Things were becoming very difficult for them to survive apart from the work that they did. The clubs were closed, many of them were arrested, and many of them were executed. So that is what happened during the Reign of Terror, and that is the root cause for such a great revolt and agitation among women, where they demanded for more rights. Women's movements for voting rights and equal wages continued through the next 200 years in many countries of the world. It doesn't mean that with all these revolutions that everything was becoming smooth for women, or the standard of living of women was going to be raised. It is not like that. For the next 200 years across the world, they had to simply fight and struggle, especially for equal wages. So men were paid higher. If they worked in the same place, men were usually paid higher than the women. So they fought for voting rights. That is, they wanted a representation in the government, in the constitution, and also they wanted to be paid equal wages. The fight for the vote was carried out through an international suffrage movement during the late 19th and early 20th century. So this will be seen in the later chapters that is prescribed for you this year, where the fight for the vote was rising high. It was not as was expected, because every time they took a step forward, they were forced to take 3 steps back. It was like that. So they decided to fight for it continuously through an international suffrage movement. The example of the political activities of French women during the revolutionary years was kept alive as an inspiring memory. So everything started from France. Even the inspiration to fight against the foreign rule started from France, both men and women. So even in the case of women, everything was an inspiring memory immediately after the French Revolution. So that is why French Revolution is so important in world history. It was finally in 1946 that women in France won the right to vote. This year is remarkable and you have to keep it in mind. 1946, women in France won the right to vote. Till then they had to really fight and they had to struggle for it. Now the source box gives some information. Look at this woman. Her name is Olympe de Gouges. She was a revolutionary woman, and it's not very easy to be a revolutionary, especially during a revolution. But she took all the stand to stand against everything that was going for injustice. Let's see what this person is. Olympe de Gouges was one of the most important of the politically active women in revolutionary France. We saw that many important women were arrested, and she also protested against the constitution, especially against Declaration of Rights of Man and Citizens. We saw a few points from this declaration where more privilege was given to men and not to women, as they excluded women from basic rights that each human being was entitled to. So the constitution clearly said that everybody is granted a right when they are born, and nobody can confiscate or take away that title. So here in the Declaration of Rights of Man and Citizen, there was no basic right entitled to women. More of it was given to men, and they enjoyed the privilege. So in 1791 she herself wrote a declaration of the rights of women and citizen. So based on the previous one, apart from that, as a second part to that, she herself coined Declaration of the Rights of Women and Citizen. So the other one was known as Declaration of Rights of Man and Citizen, which she addressed to the Queen and to the members of the National Assembly, demanding that they act upon it. So it was addressed to the Queen and some of the members of the National Assembly. In 1793, Olympe de Gouges criticized the Jacobin government for forcibly closing down women's clubs. So Jacobin government, under the effective leadership of Robespierre, forced all the women clubs to be closed down, to be shut down, and that really triggered the great revolt against the nation on behalf of women. She was tried by the National Convention, that is the new form of constitution which came into being, convention, the National Convention, which charged her with treason. Soon after this, she was executed. So most of the lives of the revolutionaries ended there. It's like they take a step forward for some kind of reform and then they're executed. So it was not very easy to get through it. Now, what were the rights coined by Olympe? The Declaration of the Rights of Women and Citizens. Some of the points are given here. The first one is, woman is born free and remains equal to man in rights. So equality is the first point there. The second point is, goal of all political associations is the preservation of the natural rights of women and man. So there again it is political equality, where the right will have to be granted to both man and women. These rights are liberty, property, security, and above all resistance to oppression. So a slight alteration was made from the Declaration of Rights of Man and Citizen, where she included the word women. Moreover, she included the rights to be granted to women. The third point, the source of all sovereignty resides in the nation, which is nothing but the union of women and man. So whatever representation takes place, where any decision is taken in a nation, she is trying to say that everything is based on the union of women and man, and not just in the unity of men alone. The law should be expression of the general will. All female and male citizens should have a say, either personally or by their representatives in its formulation. So here she has included women again, where female citizens also should have a say in the constitution, in the National Assembly, and based on that only the law should be formed. It should be the same for all, the same right, the same kind of privilege should be given to everybody. All female and male citizens are equally entitled to all honors and public employment. So it is like equality, where Both male and female citizens were given honors, where they were given rights and also privilege to be a part of public employment according to their abilities and without any other distinction than that of their talents. So according to their abilities, according to what they have got merit. Like earlier we saw that birth decided everything. If you are born into a social class of first estate, you are a noble. So it was not like that. The credit or the merit will have to be given based on their abilities and talents, and there shouldn't be any distinction between man and women, devoid gender. No woman is an exception. She is accused, arrested and detained in cases determined by law. So nobody is an exception. Everybody will have to be treated equally. So because among women also there will be distinction. For example, women from the higher strata of the society, that is the first estate, were given more privileges. So that also should be not encouraged. So no woman is an exception. Everybody will have to face the law equally. Women like men obey this rigorous law. So it was known as a rigorous law where people had to equally obey everything. In 1793, the Jacobin politician Chomet sought to justify the closure of women's clubs on the following grounds. So this particular politician, you can see the picture here, he was the one who sought to just close the clubs which was run by women. Why? The reason is given below. Has nature entrusted domestic duties to men? Has she given us breast to nurture babies? So because of all these reasons, women should be just taken away from the clubs where they have to just look into the domestic duties. No, she said to man, be a man. So this particular person is trying to say to men that you have to be a man who will be engaged in hunting, agriculture, political duties, and that is your kingdom. And to women what was told is, be a woman, the things of the household, the sweet duties of motherhood, those are your tasks, nothing beyond that. Shameless are those women who wish to become men. Have not duties been fairly distributed? So is it not fairly distributed? He is trying to support his point that women are destined to do only certain part of the duties and be a part of the society. Now next is a very important part which actually had a great reform in many parts of the countries across the world. In America we saw this, we saw in different parts of the world, because the colonizers definitely they were prone to oppression. The only tool, the only weapon that they used against the colonized, against the third world, was oppression. So now in France also they were fighting for slavery, for the abolition of slavery. One of the most revolutionary social reforms of the Jacobin regime was the abolition of slavery in the French colonies. The colonies in the Caribbean, Martinique, Guadeloupe and San Domingo were important suppliers of commodities such as tobacco, indigo, sugar and coffee. So these colonies are very important, especially the French colonies in the Caribbean, and even in literature you can say that many writers were influenced to write about the sufferings that the slaves undertook, and from there we have a lot of books and a lot of philosophy and sociology. So these places had prominent slavery, and that is because they had important commodities. They produced commodities like tobacco, indigo, sugar and coffee. But the reluctance of Europeans to go and work in distant and unfamiliar lands meant a shortage of labor on the plantations. So they could not work. They just knew to supervise. The labor was an important part of getting commodities, of getting materials, of finishing things. So that was something which they struggled with, and of course the white man always has that attitude. They definitely had that attitude in those days, and there was a shortage of labor, so for that they had to transport people on the plantations to especially export tobacco, indigo, sugar and coffee. So this was met by a triangular slave trade between Europe, Africa and the Americas. They used to slave trade, they used to buy and sell people for the purpose of plantation, for the purpose of working in the plantations. The slave trade began in the 17th century. French merchants sailed from the ports of Bordeaux or Nantes to the African coast, where they bought slaves from local chieftains. So you will have local people who were rich and who were like businessmen, and they used to get engaged in this trade. So instead of selling commodities, or apart from selling commodities, they will give a contract where they will get hold of people who will work in other places. So they used to keep the slaves imprisoned with them and sell them to the people who came from France. So you had the help of the local chieftains in Africa, where they imprisoned the slaves and it was sold to the French authorities who came for trade. Branded and shackled, the slaves were packed tightly into the 3-month-long voyage across the Atlantic to the Caribbean. So don't think that the journey was a very pleasant one, because the mode of transport was not so progressive in those days. So they had to take a 3-month-long voyage across the Atlantic, and finally they come to France and work in the plantation. So what will happen during the process? Many may just die, many may just perish, and they were not allowed to even sit. They were packed tightly like goods, and they had to just sit there, and in very poor conditions they were transported. They were beaten, they were shackled, and they were just treated not even like prisoners, but something below that. There they were sold to plantation owners. So look at the trade that is happening there. So from Africa, people are bought by the chieftains or primarily imprisoned, and from there French authorities will come and buy them, and then these people will transport them to France, and there in France they are sold to plantation owners. It's like goods only. So that was a treatment given to the slaves, and that really had to be abolished.